She was 48 years old, and by the first frost of 1887 she owned nothing in this world but the clothes on her back, a Bible with her mother's handwriting in the flyleaf, and $14 sewn into the hem of her petticoat. It was her husband's own brother, Silas Calloway, who put her out of the farmhouse she had scrubbed and mended and loved for 22 years, standing in the doorway with the deed in his hand and telling her, not unkindly but not kindly either, that a widow with no sons had no claim on land that belonged to the Calloway name. She walked into the town of Cedar Fork, Wyoming Territory, with a carpetbag and a grief so heavy it bent her shoulders, and there, at the ragged edge of town where the creek bent away from the road, she spent $9 of her $14 on a crumbling, forgotten icehouse that the whole town agreed wasn't worth the dirt it sat on. Even the man who sold it to her, old Amos Fenn, warned her she was a fool, that the roof leaked and the walls were rotten and nothing had been stored inside it in a decade. But sealed beneath the sawdust and silence of that abandoned icehouse lay something that would not only turn her fortunes inside out, but would, before another winter passed, save the very town that had watched her walk away with nothing and said nothing at all. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Etta Calloway. If you have ever been told that you were worth less than the ground beneath your feet, we hope you will stay with us tonight, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Etta Calloway had not always been a woman who counted pennies through cloth. She had been born Etta Marsh in 1839 in the hill country of eastern Ohio, the third of 6 children to a father who cut ice for a living on the frozen ponds of Portage County, and a mother who kept the house running on faith, thrift, and a will like hammered iron. It was from her father, Josiah Marsh, that Etta learned the trade that would one day matter more than she could have guessed. She learned, as a girl of 9 and 10, to walk out onto ice thick enough to bear a wagon and know it by the sound her boots made and the color beneath the surface, to saw great blocks free with a crosscut saw taller than she was, to pack them in sawdust and straw in a windowless icehouse so they would keep clear through the worst of an Ohio August. She learned, too, that ice was not simply a commodity to be sold, but a kind of mercy. It was what kept milk from turning in a hot July, what brought down a child's fever, what let a doctor pack a wound through a long ride to town. Her father used to say that a man who dealt honestly in ice was dealing in trust, because the customer could not see, until the block arrived, whether he had been cheated, and so a good iceman built his whole living on being believed. She married Thomas Calloway in 1859, a soft-spoken homesteader with sunburned hands and a laugh that came rarely but meant everything when it did, and together they traveled west in a wagon train 2 years later, chasing the promise of land in the Wyoming Territory the way so many did in those years, believing hardship shared was hardship halved. They settled along Cedar Creek, built a soddy first and then a proper frame house, raised wheat and a little livestock, and buried 2 infant children in the small cemetery behind the Methodist chapel before their third child, a daughter named Ruth, lived past her first winter and grew in time into a young woman who married a cattleman from Laramie and moved 300 miles away, writing letters that arrived less and less often as the years wore on. Thomas and Etta grew old together on that land, working it side by side, and it was Etta who kept the books, who knew to the penny what the harvest had brought and what the taxes required, because Thomas, for all his gentleness, had never had a head for figures. She had also never lost her father's knowledge of ice and cold storage, and more than once she had used an old root cellar dug into the hillside to keep butter and meat through summers that would have spoilt a lesser household stores, a small skill that made her, in a quiet way, indispensable to her neighbors, who came to her for advice on keeping their own provisions when the heat pressed down. There was a particular evening, some years before Thomas's death, that Etta would return to often in her memory in the hard seasons that followed. A summer storm had taken out the Hendricks family's root cellar 2 farms over, spoiling nearly everything they had put by for winter, and Etta had walked the 3 miles herself before dawn, carrying what she could spare from her own stores and a jar of the brine she used to keep meat through the worst heat, because she had learned from her father that the difference between a family that survived a hard year and one that did not was very often nothing more than a neighbor willing to share what little cold and dry storage could be improvised. She never spoke of it afterward, and the Hendricks family, in their gratitude and perhaps their pride, never spoke of it either, but it was the kind of quiet transaction that made up the whole fabric of a frontier town, 100 small debts of kindness passed back and forth that no ledger but memory ever recorded, and Etta had always believed, without quite putting words to it, that a community survived only for as long as its people kept faith with that unspoken accounting. Thomas died of a fever in the spring of 1886. And it was in the months after his death that Etta discovered how thin the ground beneath a woman's feet truly was in that country and in that time. The land, it turned out, had been recorded in Thomas's name alone, an oversight neither of them had thought twice about in 30 years of marriage, and Wyoming law, along with a will that had never quite been finished, gave Silas Calloway, Thomas's younger brother, a legal claim that no court in the territory would trouble to question. Silas had never worked that land, had in fact left it for the gold camps of Montana as a young man and returned only when there was something worth returning for. But he arrived with papers and a lawyer from Cheyenne, and Etta, who had given every year of her adult life to that farm, found herself standing outside her own kitchen door with her belongings in 2 trunks, watching a man she had fed at her own table for years walk through her house as though he had built it himself. She wrote to her daughter Ruth, but the letter that came back weeks later explained gently that her husband's cattle operation was struggling and there was no room. Not yet, perhaps not for a long while, and Etta understood. Without bitterness she let herself show that she was, for the first time since she was a girl of 19, entirely and utterly alone in the world. She was too proud, and too much her mother's daughter, to beg. She took the $14 she had managed to keep hidden from Silas's tallying, money she had earned selling preserves and eggs at the Cedar Fork market over the years, money he had not thought to ask about because he had not thought a woman capable of earning anything at all, and she walked the 4 miles into town with her trunks left behind at the church, where the minister's wife had promised to keep them safe. She meant only to find a room to let and perhaps work as a seamstress or a cook until she could see her way to something more permanent. But as she passed the old fen property at the edge of town, down where Cedar Creek widened before it bent south, her eye caught on the squat, half-collapsed shape of what had once been the town's icehouse, and something in her, some old stubborn instinct planted by her father 30 years before, made her stop and look at it longer than a sensible woman would have. The Cedar Fork Icehouse had been built in the early 1860s by a Norwegian immigrant named Ingvar Solberg, a quiet, capable man who had come west with the promise of the railroad and stayed instead to cut ice from the creek each winter and sell it through the long dry Wyoming summers to the butcher, the hotel, the doctor, and any family willing to pay for the small luxury of a cold cellar in July. For nearly 2 decades the Icehouse had been the beating heart of the town's summer commerce. Its double walls packed with sawdust insulation 12 inches thick, its deep pit dug below the frost line where the largest blocks could keep from December clear through September. But Solberg had died suddenly in 1881, found collapsed in his own icehouse one October morning with no family known to claim him and no will ever found, and in the years since, the coming of a small mechanical ice manufacturing plant 2 towns over had made the old cutting and storing trade seem antiquated, slow, and unnecessary. The building had passed to the town for unpaid taxes, then to Amos Fenn for almost nothing, and had sat ever since sinking slowly into the weeds, its roof caved in on one corner, its great oak door hanging by a single hinge, regarded by the whole of Cedar Fork as an eyesore and a waste of good creekside land. When Etta asked Amos Fenn that very afternoon what he wanted for it, he laughed, not cruelly, and told her $9 would more than cover it, that she could have the land and be rid of the building for all he cared, because it wasn't worth the dirt it sat on and never would be again. She paid him on the spot, in coins she counted into his palm with hands that did not shake though her heart was pounding, and she walked the last stretch of road to stand before the ruin that was now, improbably, entirely her own. The neighbors who saw her that evening, sweeping the threshold with a broom she had begged from the mercantile, shook their heads and murmured to one another that grief had plainly turned the poor widow Calloway simple, that no sensible woman spent her last dollars on a collapsing icehouse when a room above the saloon could be had for less and would at least keep the rain off her properly. Etta heard the whispers and let them pass over her the way she had once let a hard wind pass over the wheat, bending but not breaking, because she had already noticed something the whispering women had not, that the deep central pit of the icehouse, 12 feet down and lined with fieldstone, was dry as a bone despite the building's ruin, and that old Ingvar Solberg, whatever else had befallen him, had built his icehouse to last 100 years. Her first night in Cedar Fork she slept on a pallet of straw in the driest corner of the building, beneath the section of roof that had not yet fallen in, wrapped in a quilt that still smelled faintly of her old farmhouse, and she told herself, as she stared up at the few stars visible through the broken shingles, that she would make something of this place if it took every remaining year God gave her. In the morning she began to clear it in earnest, hauling out rotted sawdust and broken timber, and it was on the 3rd day of her work, prying up a section of the pit stone flooring that had buckled with age, that her fingers found the edge of something that was not stone at all but iron, a small strongbox, rusted nearly solid, wedged into a hollow beneath the flagstones where it had plainly been placed by careful hands and never disturbed since. It took her the better part of an hour, working with a chisel borrowed from the blacksmith and a patience that had carried her through harder things than a stubborn lock, to pry the box open, and when she did, what she found inside was not gold, though for one breathless moment she half expected it, but paper. A thick bundle of documents wrapped in oilcloth to keep the damp away, along with a small leather ledger whose cover had cracked with age but whose pages, protected inside the oilcloth, were still legible in a careful foreign-flavored hand. She sat back on her heels in the dim, cold pit and began, by the light slanting through the broken roof, to read the private accounts of Ingvar Solberg, and what she read there made her forget, for the first time in months, the ache of everything she had lost. The ledger told the story of a man who had arrived in Cedar Fork with almost nothing, and had spent 20 years quietly building not just a business but a kind of promise. Solberg had never married, had no children the town knew of, and had lived so modestly that most people assumed the ice trade barely kept him fed, but the ledger showed otherwise. Year after year in careful columns, he had set aside a portion of every dollar earned, intending, as a note tucked into the back pages explained in his own halting English, to one day build Cedar Fork a proper icehouse cooperative and a public wellhouse, so that no family in town, however poor, would ever be without clean water or a means of keeping food through the worst of summer, the way he remembered families going without in the old country. He had been saving toward this for nearly 15 years at the time of his death, and the ledger's final entries, along with a folded map tucked into the oilcloth, showed that he had also quietly secured, through a series of small land purchases most of the town had forgotten or never known about, the water rights to the spring that fed Cedar Creek at its source above the Icehouse, rights that, by the terms of the original territorial survey, ran with the Icehouse property itself rather than with the town or with any other landowner downstream. She read late into that first night by lamplight, and again the following night, piecing together not just numbers but the shape of a man's whole hidden life. Solberg, it seemed, had corresponded for years with a cousin still in Norway, and though none of those letters survived in the box, his ledger referenced them in passing, noting some sent home to help a nephew emigrate, some that never came due because the nephew had died of influenza before the passage could be booked, and Solberg had simply folded the unspent money back into his savings toward the wellhouse, as though determined that some good would come of it even if the good he had first intended could no longer be delivered. There were small sketches, too, tucked between the ledger's pages, crude but careful drawings of how the wellhouse might look, a low stone building with a shingled roof and a trough long enough for the whole town's washing, and beside one such sketch he had written in his halting hand, a line that Etta copied out onto a scrap of paper and kept afterward in her apron pocket for the rest of her life, that a man's worth was not measured by what he kept, but by what he had meant to give away before his time ran out. Etta did not understand in that first hour the full weight of what she had found, but she understood enough to know that the tin box in her lap held not treasure in the ordinary sense but something far more dangerous and far more valuable, a legal claim to the water that half the town depended on, a claim that had been sitting forgotten beneath a ruin everyone had written off as worthless, waiting, it seemed to her, sitting there in the cold pit with dust in her hair, for someone patient enough and desperate enough to come looking. She spent the following weeks living a double life, by day repairing what she could of the icehouse with her own hands and the little coin she had left, and by night, in the flickering light of a borrowed lamp, working through Solberg's ledger and the accompanying documents with the same careful attention she had once given her own farm's accounts. She learned that Solberg had recorded, in a separate section near the back of the ledger, a long list of names, nearly every family in Cedar Fork, going back to the town's founding, with small sums beside each one, and it took her some days of puzzling to understand that these were not debts owed to Solberg but debts he considered himself to owe them, small kindnesses and unpaid favors he had tracked with the same precision he gave his own finances. A winter when he had let the Hendricks family have ice on credit through a hard year and never collected. A summer when he had quietly paid the doctor's bill for a laborer's sick child and never told a soul. He had meant, the notes made clear, to repay the whole town at once, publicly, with the cooperative icehouse and wellhouse he never lived to build, a gesture meant to settle every quiet debt in one generous stroke rather than let any family feel singled out or pitted. Etta found herself weeping over that ledger more than once, Not for herself but for a lonely, careful man 20 years dead who had loved a town that scarcely remembered his name, and she resolved, somewhere in those long nights, that she would finish what he started, whatever it cost her. But she also understood, with the same clear-eyed practicality her father had taught her on the ice ponds of Ohio, that a woman alone with an old ledger and a stack of yellowed deeds would need more than good intentions to make her claim stand, especially once word got out, as it inevitably would, that the spring above Cedar Creek belonged, on paper, to a widow the town had already dismissed as a fool. She began, carefully and without announcing her purpose, to have the documents examined, first by the aging circuit lawyer who passed through Cedar Fork twice a year, who confirmed after long study that the water rights described were, to his knowledge of territorial law, both real and enforceable, and then more discreetly still by the county recorder's office in Cheyenne, where she traveled by stage with her last few dollars to confirm that the original survey filings matched Solberg's map. Precisely. It was inevitable that her quiet digging would eventually be noticed, and it was Silas Calloway, of all people, who noticed it first and fastest, because Silas, in the months since taking the farm, had set his sights on a far larger prize than a widow's inheritance. He had been in private talks with a land speculator out of Cheyenne to sell water access from Cedar Creek to a proposed cattle shipping operation that would need enormous quantities of water for stockyards and holding pens, a deal that depended entirely on nobody upstream having any prior claim to the spring. When word reached him, through a talkative clerk at the recorder's office, that his own former sister-in-law had been asking pointed questions about water rights tied to the old Solberg Icehouse, Silas understood at once what she must have found, and he understood too that if her claim held, his deal with the speculators would collapse, because no one would pay to pipe water they had no legal right to move. He came to her not with threats at first but with an offer, arriving at the Icehouse on a warm afternoon in early summer dressed finer than she had ever seen him, offering to buy the property outright for a sum that would have seemed, to the woman he had put out of her own farmhouse the year before, like an overwhelming fortune. Etta listened to him with the same patient stillness she had once used to calm a spooked horse, and when he finished she asked him plainly, without raising her voice, why a man who had told her a widow had no claim to land now wished so badly to purchase land he considered worthless. Silas's face did something complicated at that question, and he left without an answer, but he did not leave for good. Within a fortnight the whispers that had once called her a fool began to shift into something sharper and more organized, encouraged, Etta came to understand, by Silas's quiet visits to the mercantile, the saloon and the church social, where he suggested, in the careful language of a man protecting his own interests, that the widow Calloway was stirring up trouble that could cost the whole town its water if her claim ever went to court and was found to conflict with the town's existing arrangements that Silas did not mention he himself had helped negotiate away in secret. Some in town believed him outright. Others simply grew wary of a woman who had shown up with $9 and an old ruin and now claimed rights to the very creek their cattle drank from, and Etta found herself, in the space of a single summer, transformed from an object of pity into an object of suspicion, greeted with narrowed eyes at the market and left off the guest lists of gatherings she had once attended without a thought. The turning point of that difficult summer came, unexpectedly, from a source Etta had not anticipated. The schoolteacher, a serious young woman named Cora Bennett who boarded with the Hendricks family and had heard the old story of the free ice from Mrs. Hendricks herself, began, entirely on her own initiative, to have her pupils copy passages from Solberg's ledger as a penmanship exercise, reading aloud to the class the plain, careful entries of a man who had quietly paid for a stranger's medicine or forgiven a widow's unpaid bill, and the children, in the way that children often see clearly what adults have talked themselves out of, began asking their parents at supper why anyone would want to run a kind man's memory out of town. It was a small thing, a schoolroom exercise and a handful of suppertime questions, but it moved through Cedar Fork the way water moves through dry ground, slowly and then all at once, and by the time Etta stood before the town at the chapel that summer, she was not entirely without allies, though she had built none of them through argument or persuasion, only through patience and the plain telling of the truth. It might have broken a lesser woman, the swiftness with which a town could turn, but Etta had buried 2 children and a husband and had learned, in that long grief, that public opinion was a weather system to be endured rather than argued with. She kept working. She rebuilt the Icehouse roof plank by plank with lumber she earned by doing mending and laundry for the hotel, She cleared and repacked the old ice pit with fresh sawdust hauled from the mill at a rate she talked the mill owner into out of respect for her father's old trade. And she began, quietly, to do the one thing Silas had not accounted for. She went, one by one, to the families whose names appeared in Solberg's ledger of unpaid kindnesses, and told them, gently and without asking for anything in return, what the dead iceman had meant to do for them and why. She told the Hendricks family about the winter of free ice they had never known was a gift rather than an oversight. She told old Dr. Pruitt about the laborers' bills Solberg had quietly paid 20 years before. She did not ask any of them to take her side against Silas Calloway. She asked only that they remember a man the town had forgotten, and let his memory speak for itself. By late summer, the drought that had been building all season finally broke Cedar Fork's patience entirely, as the creek dropped lower than anyone could remember and the town's shared wells began to run brackish and thin. And it was in the midst of that crisis, with ranchers arguing over dwindling water and the mercantile owner rationing what little the town well still gave, that Etta Calloway called a public meeting at the Methodist chapel, and laid Ingvar Solberg's ledger, map and deeds out on the altar table for the whole town to examine for themselves. She told them plainly what she had found beneath the icehouse floor, and she told them, just as plainly, what Silas Calloway had been arranging in secret with the Cheyenne speculators, producing a copy of the very contract Silas had signed, which the circuit lawyer had helped her obtain through entirely legal means once her own claim was confirmed. The chapel went silent in a way Etta would remember for the rest of her life, and into that silence she said the thing she had been building toward all summer, that she did not intend to charge the town a single dollar for water from the spring that was legally hers, and that she meant instead to finish 30 years late, the cooperative icehouse and public well house that Ingvar Solberg had spent his whole quiet life saving to build, so that every family in Cedar Fork, rich or poor, would have clean water and a means of keeping their food through the hardest months, exactly as he had intended. Silas Calloway tried, in the weeks that followed, to salvage what he could, first by disputing the validity of the deeds in front of the very lawyer who had confirmed them, then by appealing to family loyalty in a private letter to Etta that arrived far too late to matter, and finally by attempting to convince the Cheyenne speculators to pursue the water rights through the territorial court, an effort that collapsed the moment the court examined the original 1860s survey and found Solberg's claim and therefore Etta's to be airtight. What could not be undone by any court, however, was the plain fact, known now to the whole town, that Silas had been prepared to sell away Cedar Fork's water to outside speculators during a drought that was already threatening the community's animals and gardens, purely for his own profit, and it was this, more than any legal defeat, that cost him the standing he had spent a lifetime building. He sold his portion of the old Calloway farm within the year and left for Montana much as he had as a young man, quietly and without ceremony, and though Etta never spoke of him with anything but a kind of tired sorrow, the town of Cedar Fork did not soon forget what he had nearly done to them. There was one more matter Etta insisted on settling before she considered the icehouse truly finished, and it was perhaps the quietest and most personal of all her decisions that year. She wrote to the county records office and at her own expense, had a small stone marker set at the edge of the property, near the well house, engraved simply with Ingvar Solberg's name and the years of his life, since he had been buried, at the town's expense, in an unmarked corner of the cemetery a decade before with no one troubling to remember where. She stood alone at that little stone on the afternoon it was set, in a wind coming down off the foothills that smelled faintly of the coming autumn, and she found herself speaking to a man she had never met as though he could hear her, thanking him for the trust he had left buried in the dark for someone patient enough to find, and promising him that his name would not be forgotten in Cedar Fork again. Word of the marker spread through town in the days that followed, and it did more in its own small way, to soften the last of the lingering suspicion against her than any ledger or deed ever could, because a woman who spent her own money honoring a stranger's grave was not, whatever else might be said of her, a woman chasing a fortune for herself. Through that autumn and into the following spring, Etta oversaw the rebuilding of the icehouse with a determination that drew the whole town, gradually, back to her side, not because they owed her anything but because they came to see, working alongside her hauling stone and timber, the same quiet decency in her that old Solberg's ledger had revealed in him. She used what remained of Solberg's careful savings, still legally hers as the property's inheritor once the courts confirmed her claim, not to enrich herself but exactly as he had intended. A proper stone well house was built at the spring source, piped down to a public trough in the town square so that no family would go without water even in the driest August, and the icehouse itself was rebuilt twice its old size, run as a true cooperative where any family could store their perishables. For a fair and modest fee that Etta herself set low enough that even the poorest widow or laborer's family could afford it, remembering, as she set that price, exactly what it had felt like to have $14 stand between herself and ruin. She never remarried and she never moved back to farming, but she lived the rest of her long life in a small house built onto the side of the rebuilt icehouse, close enough to hear the creak at night, and it became a kind of quiet tradition in Cedar Fork in the years that followed, for children to be brought to meet the widow Calloway and hear, if she was in the mood to tell it, the story of the old Norwegian iceman and the ledger of kindnesses he never got to give, and of the $9 that had once seemed like the foolish last gasp of a grieving woman with nothing left to lose. We began this story by telling you that Etta Calloway was 48 years old and owned nothing in the world but a Bible, some coins sewn into a hem, and a stubborn refusal to disappear quietly, and we told you that the thing she bought for $9 was a ruin the whole town agreed wasn't worth the dirt it sat on. What we did not tell you then, because we wanted you to discover it as she did, was that worth is not always visible on the surface of a thing, that a building can be judged worthless by everyone who only looks at its broken roof and rotted door, while beneath its floor lies a promise waiting, sometimes for decades, for the one person patient enough and wounded enough herself to hear it. Etta Calloway did not restore that icehouse to reclaim her pride, though pride was surely part of it, and she did not do it for revenge against the brother-in-law who had cast her out, though there must have been some quiet satisfaction in watching justice find him in its own slow time. She did it because she understood in the marrow of her that a debt of kindness left unpaid is a kind of wound on a whole community, and that the truest use of an unexpected fortune is not to hoard it against the next hardship but to spend it mending the very people who could not save you from your own. Thank you for sitting with us tonight, and for giving your evening to the story of a woman most of Cedar Fork had already written off. If her patience or her father's old lessons about ice and trust, or the quiet ledger of a lonely immigrant who never lived to see his own kindness repaid, moved something in you, we would be glad to know it. Tell us in the comments below about a time you found real value in something everyone else had already thrown away, a person, a place, or perhaps even yourself. If this story kept you company tonight, consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear that the ground beneath their feet may hold more than anyone has told them, and consider staying with us for the next story we have to tell. Until next time, stay close.